The mountains had a way of keeping their distance from the rest of the world. They rose high and quiet, pine-covered and cold, like they wanted nothing to do with men or their troubles. Jackson had chosen them for that very reason. For 5 years he had lived alone in a small log cabin, tucked into the timberline, nearly a mile above the nearest trail. No town lights reached him here, no church bells, no voices calling his name. Just wind through the trees and the steady work of surviving one day at a time. Jackson was 30 years old, but his face looked older. The lines around his eyes had been carved there by loss, not time. He was Apache by blood, and something else by circumstance raised among white men, hardened by their ways, and finally discarded by them when ambition outweighed loyalty. Once, he had been a bounty hunter, a good one. He tracked men for money, collected debts for gambling halls, and lied when lies paid better than truth. He had done it alongside a small crew, men who trusted each other with their lives. Among them was Gogi, his closest friend, the man who had shared his fire, his whiskey, and his secrets. Jackson had believed in him. That belief had cost him everything. The night his wife died, Jackson wasn't there. He had been sent out on a job, an easy one, Gogi said. Just a delay, a few extra hours away from town. While Jackson was gone, the casino where his wife worked the books was robbed. Shots were fired. Men ran. By the time Jackson returned, the blood had already soaked into the floorboards. At first it looked like bad luck. Wrong place, wrong time. Later, Jackson learned the truth. The robbery had been staged. The men were hired. The timing arranged so he wouldn't be there. His wife's death wasn't a mistake, it was acceptable loss. Gogi needed Jackson out of the way. Needed to climb higher. Needed to become the man in charge years. Jackson never confronted him. He didn't kill him. He didn't run to the law. He simply walked away from the job, from the town, from every man who had ever called him brother. He came up into the mountains and stayed. On the morning everything changed again. Jackson had gone out early to hunt. Snow dusted the ground in thin patches, just enough to hold tracks. He moved slow and quiet, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes always scanning. Hunger had a way of sharpening attention. Near the edge of a clearing, not far from an old horse corral that hadn't been used in years, he saw something that didn't belong. Footprints. Not animal. Human. Small, uneven. They cut across the frozen dirt and veered toward the corral. Jackson crouched and studied them. The stride was short, dragging. Whoever it was had been favoring one leg. There were dark spots in the soil blood. He followed the trail, every instinct alert now. The corral leaned inward with age, its boards gray and splintered, the gate hanging crooked on one hinge. Inside, the smell of old hay and rot lingered. Jackson stepped carefully, boots silent on packed earth. That was when he saw her. She was pressed against the far wall, half hidden behind a pile of straw. A young woman, awake but barely. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale with exhaustion. Her dress was torn at the hem and darkened with blood. Jackson's first thought was simple and immediate. She was badly hurt. He moved closer, knelt, and spoke low. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you." She looked at him with dark, unfocused eyes. Fear was there, but so was something else, resolve. She didn't scream, didn't try to run. She didn't have the strength. The blood on her skirt worried him. Too much of it. If she was bleeding internally, she wouldn't last long. "Where are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head weakly, trying to say something, but her voice failed. Jackson acted on instinct. He reached for the hem of her skirt, lifting it just enough to look for a wound. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Please, she whispered, hoarse and embarrassed. Stop. Jackson froze. Her eyes filled with tears, not from pain but from shame. She turned her face away and managed to say, "Ruth, it's not a wound. I'm bleeding because I'm a woman." Understanding hit him all at once. Jackson pulled his hand back immediately, standing up so fast he nearly stumbled. He turned his back to her, heat creeping up his neck despite the cold air. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know." There was a long, awkward silence, broken only by the sound of the wind pushing against the broken boards. After a moment, she spoke again. "My leg is hurt," she said. "I can't walk much farther." Jackson nodded, still not looking at her. He crouched and checked the ground instead, giving her spaces. Her ankle was swollen, the boot torn. That much he could see without crossing a line. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried, failed, slumped back against the wall, breathing hard. Then she looked up at him and said the words that changed everything. "Please," she said, "if I stay here, I'll die. I need help." Jackson closed his eyes. For years he had lived by one rule. Don't get involved. Don't save anyone. Don't be responsible for another life. He had already failed once, and the cost of that failure still followed him in his sleep. But this woman wasn't asking for heroics. She wasn't asking him to fight, or lie, or kill. She was asking him not to walk away. Jackson turned back to her. He studied her face, young, exhausted, stubbornly alive. He thought of his wife, of the night he hadn't been there, of the choice he had made to survive instead of stay. "If you stay here," he said slowly, "you won't make it through the night." She swallowed. "And if I go with you?" He hesitated. "You might live." That was the best promise he could give. Jackson knelt in front of her and turned his back. "I'm going to lift you," he said. "Hold on if you can." She did. He stood with her weight on his shoulders, feeling how light she was, how fragile. He carried her out of the corral and back into the trees, away from the place where she would have died alone. Behind them, the footprints filled slowly with drifting snow, as if the mountain itself was already trying to forget they had ever been there. Jackson didn't look back. For the first time in 5 years, he chose not to walk away. Jackson carried her the last half-mile through timber and snow, his breath coming steady despite the weight. The trail rose gently toward his cabin, the ground uneven, the trees thick enough to block most of the wind. She clung to his shoulders without a word, jaw set, refusing to cry out even when her injured ankle shifted and sent pain through her leg. The cabin appeared the way it always did plain, low, and built for weather rather than comfort. Pine logs stacked tightly, a stone chimney, and a porch that sagged just enough to remind a man that time never stood still. Jackson pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. Warmth lingered from the fire he'd banked that morning. He laid her down on the narrow bed near the hearth and stepped back at once, giving her saises. He could see now how pale she was, how tired. Survival had wrung her dry. "I'll get water," he said. She nodded, eyes half closed. Jackson moved with practiced efficiency, kettle on the stove, blankets pulled from a chest. Fire stirred until it breathed again. He set the water near her and turned away, unsure of where to put his hands or his eyes. He had lived alone too long. There were things he knew how to do: hunt, track, kill if needed. This was not one of them. When he returned to the bedside, she spoke quietly. "I'm sorry about earlier." He shook his head. "No need." A pause stretched between them. I don't have what I need," she said, choosing her words carefully. "I can't take care of myself right now." Jackson understood what she meant. The realization settled heavy in his chest. He looked at the floor, then at the door. "There's a woman," he said. Lives about a quarter-mile down the ridge. An old widow. If she's home, she might help." Relief crossed her face, followed by something like gratitude. "Thank you." Jackson pulled on his coat and stepped back into the cold. The sky had darkened to a dull gray, snow threatening again. He reached the widow's cabin in minutes, knocked once, then again. The door opened to a woman well past 70, hair white and braided down her back, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She took one look at Jackson and raised an eyebrow. "What trouble you bringin' me today, boy?" "There's a young woman hurt," he said simply. "I don't know how to help her properly." The old woman studied him for a long moment, then grabbed her shawl and stepped outside without another word. Back at the cabin, Jackson opened the door and stepped aside. The old woman went in first. She took one glance at the woman on the bed and nodded to herself. "Out," she said to Jackson. He didn't argue. Jackson stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. The wood creaked under his boots as he paced once, then stopped. He leaned against the post and stared out at the trees, ears burning. Embarrassment sat on him like a weight. He felt foolish, exposed like a young man again, not the mountain ghost he'd bethought. Inside, there were low voices, the sound of water, the rustle of fabric. Jackson focused on the ridgeline instead, counting breaths, counting the years he'd spent avoiding moments like this. After a long while, the door opened. The old woman stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. "She'll be fine," she said. "Needs rest, food." And that ankle kept still. Jackson nodded. "Thank you." She looked at him more closely now. "You did right asking for help. I didn't know what else to do." "That's how you know it was right," she said, then turned and walked back down the trail. Jackson waited a few more minutes before going inside. The cabin felt different now, softer somehow. The young woman lay cleaner, more at ease beneath the blankets. Color had returned faintly to her cheeks. She looked at him when he entered. "Thank you," she said again. He set a bowl of thin porridge on the table and carried it to her. "Eat slow." She did. Later, when the fire burned low and the wind picked up outside, she spoke. "I should tell you why I was running." Jackson didn't answer right away. He added another log to the fire, sat in the chair by the window, and waited. "I was with someone," she said. "A powerful man. A leader among bounty hunters." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I loved him," she went on. "Or I thought I did. I learned things I wasn't meant to know. About men he'd sold out. About people who disappeared. When I tried to leave, he locked me away." She looked at her hands. "I escaped. If he finds me, I won't live." She never said a name. Jackson didn't ask for one. He thought of Gogi, of ambition dressed up as loyalty, of how easily men convinced themselves that power made them right. "You can stay here," Jackson said, "long as you need." Her eyes lifted, searching his face. "Why would you do that?" He looked at the fire. "Because I didn't before." That night, she slept deeply, the exhaustion finally claiming her. Jackson sat by the window until the moon rose and fell behind the trees. The bottle of whiskey stayed unopened on the shelf. Outside, the mountains held their silence. And under that quiet roof, two strangers rested, each carrying secrets, each learning in their own way how to trust again. Time moved differently in the high country. Days didn't rush. They unfolded. Morning light crept across the floorboards before the sun ever cleared the ridge, and evening settled in like a long breath let out. Jackson found himself measuring the weeks, not by dates, but by small change, how steady her step had become, how the snow thinned along the south-facing slope, how the cabin sounded less hollow at night. Her ankle healed slow, but sure. Jackson fashioned a splint from juniper and rawhide, tightened just enough to hold, loose enough not to steal the blood. He showed her how to lean on a walking stick, how to test the ground before trusting it. She learned fast. Pride helped. They settled into a kind of living neither of them named. Mornings began with water on the stove and the soft scrape of iron on stone as Jackson sharpened tools. She swept the floor with a broom made of willow twigs, careful not to put too much weight on her bad leg. He kept his distance when she dressed, and she never made him feel foolish for it. Respect once offered has a way of growing. One morning, she tried to cook. Jackson was outside splitting kindling when he smelled smoke, not the keen, friendly smell of a fire breathing right, but the sharp bite of something burning that shouldn't. He burst through the door with a bucket, heart hammering, and flung water toward the stove. It splashed wide. Too wide. She yelped, soaked to the bone, eyes wide as saucers. Then she laughed. A real laugh, surprised and unguarded. "I thought the cabin was going up," he said, mortified. She pushed wet hair from her face. It was just the pot. The pot, he saw then, was scorched black and ruined beyond saving. They stood there dripping and staring at each other. And then Jackson laughed too, quiet at first, then louder than he meant to. It felt strange in his chest, like stretching a muscle that had gone stiff from disuse. Later that week, she decided his coat needed mending. Jackson's winter coat had been patched and repatched, seams thick as scars. She sat by the window, needle flashing, tongue caught between her teeth. When she handed it back, he slipped it on without thinking. The coat tore clean down the seam as he moved his arm. She stared at the rip. He stared at the ceiling. "I may have missed you, Jed," she said carefully. He shrugged. "Happens?" They fixed it together, her needle slower this time, his hands holding the cloth steady. It took longer, but it held. As the days warmed, Jackson pointed out a strip of land behind the cabin where the snow melted first. "Ground's thin," he said, "but it'll grow." They cleared rocks and roots, worked the soil with a borrowed hoe until their backs ached. Jackson measured rows with his boot heel, straight enough to please the eye. She pressed seeds into the dirt beans, onions, squash covering them, like they were something precious. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "It will," he answered. The garden became a quiet promise. Each morning, they checked for signs of life, and when the first green broke through, she clapped her hands once, soft and quick, like she didn't want to scare it away. Jackson noticed things he hadn't expected to notice. How she hummed while sweeping. How she spoke to the kettle, as if it were stubborn but well-meaning. How the cabin no longer felt like a place built to endure, but one learning how to live. He drank less without deciding to. The bottle stayed where it was, because he didn't reach for it. Nights passed without the old ache driving him toward it. Sometimes she asked about the mountains where the elk crossed, where the creek ran deepest, how far the nearest town lay. He answered what he could, careful not to offer more than she asked. He never spoke of his past unless it pressed its way out. Once, as the light faded and the fire burned low, he mentioned his wife. Just one sentence. No details. She liked mornings, he said they gave a person another chance. She didn't ask what had happened. She only nodded, as if she understood something words would spoil. Then the letter came. It arrived folded tight and tucked beneath a stone at the edge of the clearing, where a man had to mean to leave it. No name, no seal, just a place and a time, written in a hand that knew how to be neat without being careful. She held it like it might bite. Jackson read it once, then again. The location named an abandoned house on the south slope, about 3 miles out. A place hunters avoided because the roof sagged and the ground fell away behind it in a long, unforgiving drop. "They found me," she said quietly. He watched the fire. Looks that way. They want to finish it. He folded the letter and set it on the table. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had edged closer to listen. She waited, not pleading, not arguing, just waiting. Jackson stood and went to the door. The night was clear, stars sharp enough to cut. He thought of the day he'd walked away from everything, of how easy it had been to tell himself it was the only choice. He thought of the garden, the green shoots pushing up through stubborn ground. "I won't run anymore," he said. She let out a breath she'd been holding too long. They didn't speak of plans that night. They cleaned the dishes, banked the fire, and went to their separate corners of the cabin. Sleep came slow, but it came. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying the smell of earth waking up. The garden waited. The mountains watched. And in the quiet between heartbeats, ordinary days took on the weight of something worth protecting. They left before dawn. Jackson woke to a sky the color of old iron, the kind that promised clear weather and hard light. He banked the fire low, packed what little they would need: water, dried venison, a coil of rope, his rifle, and a handful of cartridges. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The decision had already been made the night before, and there was no sense arguing with a choice once it had settled. She watched him from the table, hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. Her ankle was better now, still tender, but strong enough to carry weight. She had bound it tight herself, movements practiced and quiet. "You don't have to do this," she said once, not pleading, just stating a truth he already knew. "I know," Jackson replied. They stepped outside as the first line of sun cut across the ridge. The mountains were still and white, the air cold enough to bite the lungs. Jackson locked the cabin door out of habit, then paused. He hadn't locked it in years. The trail led south, winding through timber and rock. They walked single file, Jackson ahead, setting a pace that didn't push her too hard. Every so often he slowed without saying why. He had learned to listen to the land, and the land had a way of speaking if a man paid attention. After a mile, she spoke. "They threatened my family," she said. "My parents, my younger brother. They're still in Mexico." Jackson nodded, eyes forward. "You have proof?" "Yes." She tapped the satchel at her side. "Names, place, deals. Enough to ruin them if it ever sees daylight. And enough to get you killed if it doesn't," he said. She didn't argue. They reached the south slope just as the sun cleared the peaks. The abandoned house sat crooked against the incline, its boards bleached and split, windows dark and empty. Behind it, the ground fell away in a steep drop, scattered with rock and scrub that would tear a body apart long before it reached the bottom. Jackson studied the place through the trees. They picked it for a reason. She swallowed. "I know." He signaled her to stay back and circled wide, checking the ground, the wind, the angles of approach. No birds, no movement. Too quiet. "Stay close," he said when he returned. "And if I tell you to run, don't argue." She met his eyes. "I won't." They stepped into the open together. The voice came from the house, smooth and amused. "Well, you made it." Jackson recognized it the moment it carried across the yard. The cadence, the confidence that came from men who'd never paid for their choice. Gogi stepped out of the doorway, flanked by two men Jackson didn't know. He was broader now, heavier around the middle, beard trimmed neat. Power had agreed with him. Gogi's gaze slid from Jackson to the woman, then back again. A slow smile spread across his face, not pleased exactly. Assessing. "So this is how it ends," Gogi said. "You bring my girl to me." She stiffened. "I'm not yours." Gogi laughed. "You were." He turned to Jackson. "Did you know she ran because she was scared?" Jackson said nothing. "She ran because she knew too much," she said, voice steady. And because you locked me in a room when I tried to leave. Gogi shrugged. Protection. That's not protection, Jackson said quietly. That's a cage. Gogi's smile thinned. Funny coming from you. I thought you didn't care anymore. Jackson stepped forward. I thought I didn't either. The air tightened. One of the men shifted his weight, hand drifting toward his belt. She spoke then, clear and unafraid. I loved you, she said to Gogi, until I learned what you were. Gogi's eyes hardened. You don't get to judge me. She does, Jackson said. So do I. Gogi sighed like a man disappointed by weather. You always were soft, Jackson. That's why I had to move you aside. The words landed where they were meant to. Jackson's grip tightened on his rifle. He saw it all again. The empty casino floor. The blood on the boards. The way the truth had come too late to matter. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. You set it up, Jackson said. You knew I wouldn't be there. Gogi didn't deny it. Business. The fight came fast after that. One of Gogi's men lunged. Jackson fired once, the shot cracking sharp in the cold air. The man dropped. The other broke and ran, scrambling toward the trees. Gogi drew his knife. They closed the distance, years of shared history collapsing into a single violent moment. They grappled, boots slipping on dirt and stone. Gogi was strong, but Jackson was steady, anchored by something heavier than anger. They broke apart near the edge. You could have been something, Gogi spat. You could have ruled with me. Jackson drove forward, forcing him back. I'm done taking orders. Gogi stumbled. The ground gave, his heel slid. Jackson stopped inches away. This is for her, Jackson said, and for my wife. Gogi laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. Then the ground took him. The sound carried down the slope and was gone. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left. Jackson stood there breathing hard, the world narrowing to the thud of his heart. Then he turned. She was watching him, face pale but resolute. He expected fear. What he saw instead was relief, tempered by sorrow. It's over, she said. He nodded. For him. They didn't linger. The house had nothing left to say. The walk back was slower, heavier. The mountains looked the same, but Jackson felt the weight shift inside him, like a load finally set down. When the cabin came into view, the garden caught the lights, small, green, stubborn. Jackson unlocked the door and held it open. She stepped inside, safe for the moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the echoes of choices made and debts paid. The past had found them, as it always did, but it hadn't won. They didn't speak on the way back. The mountains had gone quiet in that peculiar way. They did after violence, as if the land itself were waiting to see what kind of men survived their own actions. Jackson walked ahead, rifle slung low, senses still sharp though the danger had passed. Behind him, she followed, her steps careful, measured, like someone afraid to leave too deep a mark. The cabin came into view just as the light began to soften. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, where the fire still lived beneath ash. Home, if it could be called that, stood solid and unchanged as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't tilted and righted itself somewhere behind them. Jackson unbarred the door and stepped aside. She entered first, setting her satchel on the table. He followed, closed the door, and leaned his weight against it for a moment longer than necessary. It was done, he told himself. The man who had shaped so much of his grief lay broken at the bottom of a ravine. The threat had ended. He could finally lay the past down. He turned. She was standing near the table, back to him, shoulders tied. Her hands trembled as she loosened the satchel strap. Are you hurt? He asked. No, she said quickly. Too quickly. Jackson frowned. Then what is it? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the satchel and drew out a folded bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She placed it on the table but didn't open it. "These are the papers," she said. "The proof." He nodded. "We'll take them to town when it's safe." She swallowed. "There's more." Something in her voice made his chest tighten. "More than what?" he asked. She turned then, and he saw it in her eyes. Before she ever spoke, the apology already there. The grief that had nothing to do with Gogi's death. "I wasn't only running," she said. "I was sent." The words didn't land all at once. They came apart, like boards splitting under pressure. "Sent?" Jackson repeated. She took a step toward him, then stopped, as if an invisible line held her back. "He wanted to know where you were, if you were alive, if you were still dangerous." The cabin felt smaller, the walls closer. "You told me you didn't know who he was," Jackson said. "I didn't say his name," she replied, tears gathering. "But I knew." Jackson shook his head slowly, as if that might rearrange the truth into something else. "Why?" She reached for the oilcloth, unwrapped it, and revealed a knife slim, well-balanced, familiar to men who made their living ending things. "I was supposed to use this," she said. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press the air from his lungs. "You were going to kill me," Jackson said. "No." Her voice broke. "I was told to. I couldn't." His hands clenched at his sides. Every ordinary day they had shared rose up between them. The burned pot, the split coat, the garden pushing green through stubborn dirt. He had let himself believe in those things, had built something fragile atop them. "You looked me in the eye," he said. "You told me you cared." "I do," she said, stepping closer now despite herself. "That part was never a lie." Jackson laughed once, sharp and empty. "That's the worst kind." She reached for him, stopped inches away. "They threatened my family. If I didn't do what he asked, if I didn't get close to you, they would die." Jackson turned away, walked to the window. Outside, the mountains stood indifferent, eternal. He pressed his palm to the glass, grounding himself in something solid. "So you were bait," he said. "Yes. And I was the trap." She nodded, tears spilling now. "But I couldn't do it. I couldn't hurt you. I tried to tell myself I could, but every day it became impossible." He faced her again. "Then why bring the knife back here?" "Because I needed you to know," she said, "before I left." The word struck deeper than the blade ever could. "Left," he echoed. "You're leaving." She nodded again. "I can't stay. Not after this. Not after what I almost did." "You didn't do it," he said. "I would have," she replied softly. "If I'd been weaker." Jackson closed his eyes. He saw his wife's face as she'd been before the blood, before the silence. Trust once broken, never fit together the same way again. "You should go," he said. The words tasted like ash. She flinched. "I don't want to." "I know," he said. "That doesn't change what is." She stared at him, searching for something, permission, forgiveness, a way back. He had none to give. Slowly, deliberately, she walked to the door. Before opening it, she turned. "I never meant to survive by destroying someone else," she said. "If there's any truth you keep from this, keep this. What I felt for you was real." Jackson didn't answer. She opened the door and stepped out into the late light. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. Jackson stood alone in the cabin. The fire crackled. The garden waited outside. Everything was as it had been, and nothing was. He picked up the knife from the table and carried it to the door. When he opened it again, she was already halfway down the trail. Jackson walked to the edge of the clearing and hurled the knife into the ravine where Gogi had fallen. He listened until the sound disappeared. Then he went back inside, shut the door. and sat down. That night, the mountains did not answer his silence. 2 years changed a man. Jackson learned that the hard way. The mountains were still there, still vast and unbothered, but he no longer hid inside them. He came down in stages, first to the edge of town, then into it, then finally among people again. Silver Bend wasn't much to look at. One main road, a feed store, a church that leaned a little, and a handful of wooden buildings that stalled of coffees and horses' sauces. But it was honest, and after years of running from light, honesty felt like shelter. Jackson built his new cabin on a patch of land just outside town, close enough to hear wagon wheels in the morning, far enough to keep the quiet he still needed. He planted vegetables the way he always had, carefully, patiently. Rows straight, soil turned deep. He sold what he didn't eat, traded when money felt unnecessary. Folks learned his name slowly. They liked him. He fixed fences without being asked. He kept his word. The past didn't vanish. It learned to sit quietly. Some mornings were easier than others. Some mornings he woke with her name already in his chest. Other days it stayed still, like a scar that only ached when the weather turned. It was one of those mornings, clear sky, cool air, coffee just poured when the knock came. Jackson frowned. No one knocked that early unless something was wrong. He crossed the room, opened the door. A young woman stood on the porch, holding a folded newspaper under her arm. "I've got the morning paper," she said. "Anyone home?" Her voice caught him square in the ribs. She looked thinner, stronger. Her hair was tied back simply. The sharpness of fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something steadier, something earned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she thrust the paper toward him, too fast. "Here," she said. "That's all." She turned to leave. Jackson stepped forward. "Wait." She stopped, shoulders stiff. "I didn't know you were here," she said without turning. "I didn't know you were alive," he answered. That made her turn. They stood there with 2 years stretched between them, filled with all the things neither had said. "I'm not who I was," she said quietly. "I know," Jackson replied. "Neither am I." She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I don't stay long. I just deliver the papers." "That's fine," he said. "You don't have to stay." She studied him, wary, then nodded once. "Good." She walked away, boots crunching on gravel. Jackson stood there long after she'd gone, the papers still in his hand, unread. The next morning she came again. This time she didn't leave right away. The morning after that, she asked about the garden. By the end of the week, they were talking carefully, like people handling something fragile but familiar. She never spoke of bounty hunters. He never spoke of knives or ravines. What mattered now was who they were, not who they'd been forced to be. She told him she'd cut all ties, disappeared the right way this time, changed her name, worked honest jobs, slept without fear. "I couldn't come back until I was clean of it," she said. Jackson nodded. He understood the need to earn your own reflection. One afternoon, as they worked the soil side by side, he said, "You don't owe me anything." She paused, dirt on her hands. "I know." "Then why keep coming?" She looked at him, really looked. "Because I choose to." That mattered. Months passed. Town noticed. Smiles turned knowing. No one rushed them. People who'd lived hard lives understood that some things had to come slow. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hills gold, Jackson set down his hoe. "I don't want what we had before," he said. She stiffened. "Neither do I." "I want something better," he continued. "Something built with eyes open." She searched his face. "And if the past comes back?" "Then we face it," he said. "Together, or not at all." Silence stretched. Then she nodded. They married in the small church on a quiet morning. No finery, no spectacle, just wood, light, and the sound of breath taken steady. Townfolk filled the benches. The preacher spoke of forgiveness as labor, not miracle. When Jackson took her hand, it was firm, certain. Years later, people would say the mountain man finally came home. But Jackson knew better. Home wasn't a place you ran back to. It was something you built piece by piece with the courage to stay. And this time, he stayed. And so their story reminds us that redemption is never sudden. It is built slowly, through hard choices, honest work, and the courage to forgive both others and ourselves. In the wide silence of the West, they learned that home is not where you hide, but where you stand and stay. If you enjoyed this story, please press subscribe, like, share, and leave a comment so I can continue bringing you even more meaningful stories. Thank you all for listening.